In the stillness of a dimly lit prison cell, a man sits with his head bowed, the soft hum of flickering lights above him breaking the silence. His name is John Alite, once a trusted soldier in one of the most powerful mafia families in America. His story, whispered in both fear and fascination, begins not with glory, but with betrayal. Outside these cold walls, his name is spoken with venom by those who once called him brother, enforcer, friend. To them, he is the man who broke the sacred code, the man who turned on the Gotti family. But to others, he is a survivor, a man who saw through the illusions of loyalty and chose life over silence. This is not a story of easy morals or clean endings. It's a story about shadows, where loyalty is currency, and betrayal is survival. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the name Gotti carried an aura of power that stretched far beyond the boroughs of New York. The Teflon Don, John Gotti Jr., ruled with charisma and cruelty, turning his family into legends of organized crime. Beneath him, a younger generation sought to carry the torch, none more ambitious than his son, John Gotti Jr., and beside him stood a man he trusted with his life, John Alite. Together, they moved through the underworld with the swagger of royalty. Their nights were spent under the neon lights of Queens, surrounded by fast money, faster cars, and the intoxicating sense that they were untouchable. Yet, beneath the laughter and the loyalty oaths, something darker stirred, a rivalry waiting to ignite. John Alite was not born into the Mafia's world of silk suits and blood oaths. He came from the hard streets of Woodhaven, Queens, a neighborhood where toughness was a necessity and weakness a death sentence. His reputation for fearlessness drew the attention of men who controlled the streets, men who saw in him something useful, loyalty without hesitation, and a will to do whatever it took. Soon, that fearlessness would draw him into the orbit of the Gotti family, where friendship and business blended into something far more dangerous. From the outside, it all looked perfect, two young men, bonded by ambition, climbing through the ranks of the underworld. Alite admired Gotti Jr. as a brother, Gotti trusted Alite as his right hand. Together, they enforced the Gambino family's power, ensuring that debts were paid, rivals silenced, and respect maintained. They were young, fearless, and living a life most could only imagine. But inside the glamorous illusion of mafia honor, small cracks began to form. Whispers of jealousy, quiet rivalries, and invisible lines of betrayal began to shape their destinies. In the Mafia, loyalty is sacred, a word heavier than blood. Yet it is also fragile, easily broken by pride, money, or fear. John Alite lived by that word for decades. He swore to protect his friends, to follow orders, and to never speak to the law. But as the years went on, the streets grew colder. The faces of allies turned suspicious, and the empire that once seemed invincible began to crumble under the pressure of wiretaps, indictments, and revenge. The Gotti family, once the kings of New York, found themselves hunted by the very system they had mocked. It was during those years that Alite faced the darkest question of his life: what happens when loyalty turns into a trap? When the people you protected are the same ones who abandon you? As the FBI tightened its grip, Alite fled, to Brazil, to freedom, to escape the ghosts of New York. But the past has a way of following men like him. Arrested and extradited, Alite returned to America not as a soldier, but as something far more dangerous in the eyes of the Mafia, a man ready to talk. When he took the witness stand years later, the courtroom fell silent. The man who once enforced the Gotti name was now testifying against it. Every word he spoke cut through the myth of Mafia honor, exposing what lay beneath: fear, greed, and betrayal. Some said he was lying to save himself. Others said he was finally telling the truth that no one else dared to admit. Either way, the damage was done. The betrayal that shook the Mafia world wasn't just about one man breaking silence. It was about the crumbling of an entire illusion, that loyalty in the mob was eternal. Even today, long after the trials and headlines have faded, the name John Alite stirs unease. Some remember him as a ruthless hitman, others, as a man who survived the impossible. His story blurs the line between villain and victim, between loyalty and deceit. As he sits in the half-light of his memories, he remains haunted by both what he did and what he revealed. For every crime confessed, there are secrets still buried in the streets of Queens, names never spoken, truths never proven. In the soft hum of the night, his life plays like a slow, hypnotic reel, moments of violence and brotherhood, of laughter and loss. To understand his betrayal, one must first understand the world that made him. A world where silence was virtue, where friendship could turn fatal, and where the price of trust was often blood. The story of John Alite begins here, in the shadows of loyalty, under the watchful eye of the Gotti family, in a city that never forgives and never forgets. And as the lights fade, a single question lingers in the air, a question that will echo through every chapter of his life. When a man betrays the code that once defined him, is he a coward, or is he finally free? The city never truly sleeps, and in Queens during the 1960s and 70s, that was truer than anywhere else. The nights were alive with the sound of distant trains, the hum of streetlights, and the murmurs of men gathered on corners, exchanging gossip, favors, and warnings. It was a time when the American dream and organized crime shared the same streets, when honor and violence walked hand in hand. Amid these cracked sidewalks and narrow alleyways, a young John Alite learned his first lessons about power, lessons that no school could ever teach. He grew up in Woodhaven, a neighborhood stitched together by working-class families and quiet desperation. Immigrant parents, factory workers, shop owners, they all chased the promise of stability, even as the streets whispered another kind of opportunity. On one block, a family might struggle to make rent. On the next, a man in a sharp suit drove a Cadillac, his pockets heavy with cash earned from business that nobody dared ask about. To a young boy like Alite, the difference was mesmerizing. The message was clear: strength brought respect, and respect brought freedom. As a child, Alite was restless, sharp-eyed, and observant. He saw how men deferred to those who carried themselves with quiet confidence, the ones who never had to raise their voices to be obeyed. Those men were the underworld's silent rulers. They weren't police officers or politicians. They were neighborhood figures, loan sharks, bookmakers, soldiers from the nearby crews who kept order in their own way. Everyone knew who they were, but no one ever said their names too loudly. These were the men young Alite secretly admired, the ones who made people cross the street when they passed. At home, life was simple, sometimes harsh. His family valued discipline, but the streets had their own kind of guidance. Fights were common, respect was fragile. As a teenager, Alite learned early that to survive, you had to project strength, or risk becoming a target. He spent hours at local gyms, boxing and lifting weights, not just to build muscle, but to build presence. Every bruise and cut became part of his identity, each one a silent message: he could take a hit and keep standing. The Queens of his youth was not the glittering city seen in films. It was raw, divided, and dangerous. Street corners were battlefields where grudges lingered for years, and reputations could crumble with one misstep. The Mafia had influence everywhere, from construction sites to corner bars. They weren't distant figures in suits, they were part of the community. They sponsored local sports teams, gave handouts to struggling families, and punished those who caused trouble. To the eyes of a young man, they looked less like criminals and more like kings who protected their kingdom through fear and generosity alike. Alite's introduction to that world wasn't formal, it began with favors. He'd run small errands, deliver packages, pass messages. Each task came with a few dollars slipped quietly into his hand, more money than any legitimate job would pay a kid his age. The men who paid him, men in tailored suits and polished shoes, noticed his discipline and loyalty. He was sharp, cautious, and fearless, the kind of kid who didn't flinch under pressure. They began to trust him. And trust, in that world, was currency. By his late teens, Alite was already known in Woodhaven for his toughness. He wasn't a troublemaker in the usual sense, he was strategic, always in control, never reckless. He learned that violence meant little without purpose. His fights weren't born from rage but necessity, a quiet assertion of dominance. The neighborhood respected him, and respect, in those narrow streets, was everything. The Mafia took notice. Among the figures who began to move in his orbit were the young heirs of old power, sons of made men, nephews of soldiers, friends of the Gotti name. These were not yet the hardened killers of the Gambino family but the next generation, groomed to inherit an empire. Among them was a young John Gotti Jr., the son of the man who would become the Teflon Don. Their meeting would change the course of Alite's life forever, but at this stage, it was just another introduction, two ambitious young men shaking hands under the neon glow of a Queen's night. Alite felt drawn to this world not out of greed, but out of belonging. The Mafia offered something that the ordinary world didn't: structure, purpose, identity. There were rules, codes, and a strange kind of honor that seemed more genuine than the hypocrisy of polite society. The men he admired didn't pretend to be saints. They were open about their sins, and somehow, that honesty made them magnetic. But beneath the allure, there was an undercurrent of danger he could sense even then. The same men who laughed together could turn on each other without hesitation. Trust was given one day and shattered the next. The Mafia world was beautiful from afar: elegant suits, expensive dinners, camaraderie, but up close, it was built on fear, manipulation, and quiet acts of cruelty. Still, for a young man growing up in Queens, the choice between a life of obscurity and one of power didn't feel like a choice at all. By the late 1970s, Alite was already walking the edge, part street hustler, part soldier in training. He had become fluent in the language of intimidation, negotiation, and silence. He understood that in his world, words could kill, but silence could protect. Each decision drew him closer to the Gotti family's inner circle, closer to a destiny he couldn't yet imagine. The nights in Woodhaven had a rhythm he never forgot. The metallic sound of rolling gates closing over storefronts, the distant laughter from a corner bar, the low rumble of a car idling too long on the curb. Every sound carried a story, of loyalty, betrayal, or ambition. It was a world that taught him to see before acting, to listen before speaking, and to trust no one completely. As the years went on, the young men from those streets either faded into quiet lives or disappeared into the shadows of the mob. John Alite would choose the latter. The same streets that taught him pride, courage, and loyalty would soon become the backdrop for his downfall. In the glow of streetlights and the smell of asphalt after rain, a truth lingered in the air: every man on those corners dreamed of power, but few survived long enough to enjoy it. For Alite, those early years in Queens were not just the beginning of a criminal career, they were the foundation of a mindset. A belief that the world was divided between predators and prey. And he had no intention of being the latter. He didn't yet know it, but the codes he learned on those streets, loyalty, silence, respect, would one day turn against him. The same unwritten rules that guided his rise would also write his tragedy. For now, though, under the soft hum of city lights, John Alite was just another name whispered in the dark, a kid from Queens, built by the streets, destined for infamy. The first time John Alite broke the law, it wasn't out of desperation, it was out of instinct. The streets of Queens had taught him that hesitation was weakness and that opportunity rarely came wrapped in honesty. By the time he reached his late teens, Alite had already mastered the unspoken rhythm of street life: quick deals, quicker lies, and a watchful eye for danger. Crime didn't come to him like a sudden fall, it crept in, quietly, step by step, until it felt like breathing. In the beginning, it was small things, petty thefts, quick hustles, fights that turned into lessons in dominance. He learned how to read people: who was afraid, who was bluffing, who could be pushed, and who should never be touched. These weren't random encounters, they were rehearsals for the life he was about to lead. The streets were his classroom, and every broken rule was another test he passed with ease. Queens in the late 1970s was a place where money flowed in strange directions. Behind the counters of mom-and-pop stores, cash changed hands that didn't belong to any official ledger. Everyone knew someone who was into something: gambling, loans, smuggling, or stolen goods. The Mafia's reach wasn't confined to secret meetings in smoky rooms, it lived in every neighborhood, disguised as friendship and favors. For a young man with ambition and nerve, the path to power wasn't found in education or legitimate work. It was written in those shadowy deals made under the dim streetlights. Alite's natural charm and confidence quickly set him apart. He wasn't reckless, and that made him valuable. While other young men wasted their energy on senseless fights, Alite calculated. He understood that fear could be more profitable than violence. When someone owed money, he didn't need to raise his voice. A quiet visit, a calm threat, and an unwavering stare were enough to make most men fold. People started saying that John had something about him, something dangerous but composed. That reputation began to spread, and soon, men from the Gotti crew started to notice. One of his earliest mentors was a mid-level Gambino associate, a man who saw potential in Alite's balance of aggression and intelligence. This mentor didn't teach through words, he taught through example. He showed Alite how to handle money, when to push for payment, and, most importantly, when to walk away. He explained that real power wasn't about violence, it was about control. Violence was a tool, not a habit. The ones who survived the longest were those who knew when not to use it. But control came with its temptations. With every dollar earned through intimidation, Alite felt a rush of satisfaction, not from greed, but from validation. For the first time, he wasn't just another kid from Woodhaven. He was someone people respected, someone people feared. That feeling became addictive. It wasn't long before small hustles turned into larger operations: car theft rings, gambling debts, and street collections for the Gambino family. Each step pulled him deeper into the system, a system that rewarded loyalty and punished weakness without mercy. It was around this time that John Gotti Jr. re-entered his orbit. The two young men, close in age but different in origin, recognized something familiar in each other. Gotti had inherited power through blood, Alite was earning it through grit. Their friendship blossomed in the space between respect and rivalry. Together, they started running low-level rackets, collecting debts, managing clubs, and enforcing the Gotti name across Queens and beyond. They were inseparable, partners in both business and crime, each feeding off the other's ambition. But beneath that partnership, subtle differences began to form. Gotti Jr. had grown up in a world where respect was handed to him. Alite had earned his through scars and silence. Where Gotti was loud, Alite was quiet. Where Gotti sought attention, Alite preferred the shadows. That balance made them powerful, and dangerously interdependent. Alite's first major act of violence wasn't planned. It happened during a debt collection gone wrong. A man who refused to pay, too arrogant or too foolish to understand who he was dealing with. Alite confronted him calmly, giving him chances to make things right. But when the man laughed in his face, something inside him shifted. In that moment, all the lessons of the street fused into instinct. A quick blow, a flash of pain, and silence followed. The man was left battered, not dead, but the message was delivered. Word spread fast: John Alite was no longer just a kid running errands. He was someone to fear. In the world of organized crime, reputation was currency. You could build it for years and lose it in a single mistake. Alite's reputation grew precisely because he didn't seek it. His quiet efficiency drew attention from higher-ups in the Gambino family, who began to see him as a reliable enforcer, someone who could handle business without bringing unnecessary noise. It was an honor that came with risk, but Alite welcomed it. Every order, every job, every successful collection brought him closer to the inner circle. Yet, even as his influence grew, so did the danger. The deeper he went, the more he saw of the Mafia's true nature: the duplicity, the paranoia, the unspoken truth that no one was truly safe. He watched men laugh together one night and plot each other's downfall the next. It was a world that demanded loyalty but rewarded betrayal, a system where survival depended on knowing when to trust and when to disappear. Alite understood this instinctively. It made him effective, but it also made him cautious. Through his early crimes, he learned another valuable lesson: the line between justice and vengeance was thinner than most believed. The Mafia's sense of honor wasn't about fairness, it was about control. Men didn't die because they were guilty, they died because they were inconvenient. Every job Alite took part in, every threat he delivered, reinforced that reality. But in the strange logic of his world, this made him stronger. The more ruthless he became, the safer he felt. By his early 20s, John Alite had transformed from a streetwise kid into a name that carried weight. He was trusted by Gotti Jr., respected by his peers, and feared by his enemies. But behind his growing success, a subtle restlessness lingered. He was building a life out of loyalty to a system that could destroy him at any moment. For now, though, he didn't think about that. The streets were his kingdom, and he ruled them through silence, precision, and fear. As the night stretched long and the city lights shimmered over the East River, Alite began to believe that he was untouchable. Every crime felt like another step toward destiny. The money, the power, the influence, they were intoxicating. What he didn't yet realize was that every dollar earned, every favor granted, and every act of violence committed was slowly binding him to a fate he could never escape. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice still remembered the boy who had once admired the men in suits from afar. But that boy was gone now. In his place stood a man who understood the first rule of survival in the underworld: once you've crossed the line, there's no going back. And so, under the glow of neon lights and the ever-watchful eyes of queens, John Alite took his first real steps into the Mafia's world, a world that would soon lift him to power, and then, just as swiftly, cast him into darkness. The air in Queens during the mid-1980s buzzed with tension and ambition. The Gotti name carried a weight that commanded respect and fear in equal measure, and for John Alite, that name represented both an opportunity and a destiny. It was through the doors of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, the unofficial headquarters of John Gotti's crew, that Alite first crossed into the inner sanctum of the Gambino crime family. Inside, smoke hung thick, laughter was guarded, and money flowed like an unspoken language. John Alite wasn't Italian, but he was different from the average street hustler. He had something magnetic about him, a mix of discipline, charm, and the kind of street intelligence that caught the attention of higher-ups. His Albanian roots were often seen as an obstacle in the Italian-dominated mafia world, but Alite's talent for making money and his loyalty to the crew quickly began to outweigh tradition. In this world, results spoke louder than bloodlines. John Gotti Jr. was the bridge between Alite and the infamous Gotti Empire. The two young men shared an immediate connection. Both were ambitious, charismatic, and hungry for power. They began spending long nights together, not in boardrooms or offices, but in dimly lit clubs, smoky backrooms, and bustling New York streets. Alite became not just an associate, but a trusted ally, someone who could be relied upon when things got complicated. He ran betting operations, handled collections, and ensured loyalty within the ranks. At first, their partnership seemed destined for greatness. Gotti Jr. admired Alite's confidence and efficiency. He often referred to him as, "my guy," trusting him with sensitive operations that others wouldn't dare handle. To outsiders, Alite wasn't just a friend of the goddess, he was practically family. But beneath that surface of brotherhood, silent rivalries began to take root. The Mafia, after all, thrived on suspicion. It wasn't long before Alite was seen handling delicate matters that drew attention from higher within the hierarchy. He managed lucrative rackets, kept soldiers in line, and became the face of many of Gotti Jr.'s street dealings. He ensured payments flowed smoothly and problems disappeared quietly. His name started to circulate in whispers, a man who could be trusted to make things happen without drawing heat. The relationship between Alite and the Gotti family deepened, but it wasn't without its challenges. Being non-Italian meant he could never be a made man, no matter how loyal or effective he was. Yet, he operated as if he were one, navigating the treacherous politics of mafia life with precision. He knew when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to act. In the late nights at the Bergen Club, Alite would watch John Gotti Jr. arrive, his tailored suits, his gold jewelry, and the aura that commanded the room. To Alite, it was like seeing a movie come to life. The Teflon Don represented everything the underworld admired: power without apology, respect without mercy. Alite admired him, perhaps even idolized him. But he also saw the fragility beneath the glamour, a life built on paranoia and control, where loyalty was both currency and weapon. Gotti Sr. noticed Alite too. Though he rarely spoke directly to him, he acknowledged his presence, occasionally giving a nod or a quiet smile of approval. In the Mafia, such gestures were worth more than words. Alite's status grew, and so did the danger. Every favor, every order fulfilled, and every secret kept tied him tighter to the web of the Gambino family. His friendship with Gotti Jr. was both a shield and a trap. The two men moved through the city like brothers in arms, their bonds sealed through countless shared experiences, collecting debts, settling disputes, and running the streets with confidence. Yet, the same closeness that elevated Alite also planted the seeds of future conflict. The Mafia world was unforgiving to those who climbed too fast, especially outsiders who didn't bear an Italian name. Still, Alite pushed forward, driven by loyalty, greed, and perhaps a desire to prove that he belonged. He wanted recognition not just from the Gotti family, but from the entire underworld. The streets of Queens became his domain, the bookmakers and loan sharks his soldiers. His reputation as a man who could handle anything, from negotiations to violence, made him indispensable. But in the shadows of this loyalty, cracks were beginning to form. Rumors started to spread, whispers that Alite was too independent, too ambitious, perhaps even too dangerous to remain unchecked. Gotti Jr. began to feel the weight of his father's legacy and the expectations that came with it. As the stakes rose, trust became a fragile currency. For now, though, those tensions remained buried beneath layers of shared laughter, envelopes of cash, and toasts made in smoky backrooms. Alite stood at the height of his influence, powerful yet precariously balanced on the edge of a life where betrayal was only ever one conversation away. The Gotti connection had opened every door for him, but soon enough, those same doors would begin to close, slowly, silently, and inevitably. The loyalty that had once bound them together would become the very weapon that tore them apart. What Alite couldn't know yet was that every choice he made under the shadow of the Gotti name was a step closer to a betrayal that would shake the Mafia world to its core. The late 1980s were an age of excess, and for men like John Alite, power came dressed in Italian suits and paid for in unmarked bills. Queens pulsed with underworld energy, a city within a city, built on whispered deals and invisible boundaries. Every block, every nightclub, every back-alley betting parlor carried its own rules, its own hierarchy. And Alite, now fully embedded in the Gotti orbit, was learning those rules the hard way. By now, Alite wasn't merely running errands or collecting debts. He was managing serious business, illegal gambling rings, extortion networks, and protection rackets that poured thousands into the pockets of the Gambino family every week. On the surface, he appeared calm, methodical, even polite. But beneath that exterior was a man constantly calculating, balancing loyalty with self-preservation. In this world, trust was a word used sparingly and often broken without hesitation. His operations ran through strip clubs and construction sites, from small-time bookies to union halls. Every man who paid up knew Alite's name, and every man who didn't was reminded of it, personally. Violence wasn't his first choice, but it was always his last resort, and he delivered it with a precision that earned him both fear and respect. John Gotti Jr., on the other hand, was still learning how to command the same authority as his father. While Alite preferred quiet dominance, Gotti Jr. sometimes leaned into arrogance, flashing wealth, boasting about power, showing off what his father had built. To Alite, this was dangerous. The Mafia's strength had always come from silence, from operating in the shadows, and the younger Gotti's loud persona drew unwanted attention from law enforcement. Still, Alite remained loyal. He was the enforcer, the peacekeeper, and sometimes even the strategist. When tensions flared between crews, he knew how to defuse them. When rival factions tested the goddess' influence, he stepped in, a mixture of charm and intimidation ensuring order was maintained. But with each success came greater risk. The FBI had started paying attention. Surveillance vans began to appear outside familiar bars. Phones clicked when picked up. Faces in parked cars watched too long. It was subtle at first, just background noise to men who believed they were untouchable. But Alite felt it. The heat was rising, slowly, invisibly, like water in a pot before it boils. Despite the danger, the money was too good, the thrill too intoxicating. Alite's world became a blur of late nights and high stakes. He'd meet with Gotti Jr. in the back of restaurants, their conversations hushed but confident. They discussed new ventures, street politics, and the delicate balance between fear and friendship that kept their empire alive. One night stands out in Alite's memory, a heated exchange in a dimly lit club in Ozone Park. A rival crew had encroached on Gotti territory, and Alite was furious. He argued that respect was slipping, that weakness was showing. Gotti Jr. brushed it off, confident his father's name alone was protection enough. "No one's gonna touch us," he said, smiling. But Alite knew better. In the Mafia, names carried power, until they didn't. Tensions between them began to simmer. Gotti Jr.'s pride clashed with Alite's practicality. Alite wanted to run business cleanly, efficiently. Gotti Jr. wanted recognition, to live up to his father's myth. That difference, one of mindset more than money, would quietly begin to erode the trust between them. And yet, outwardly, they were inseparable. Together they attended parties, weddings, and business meetings, presenting the perfect image of brotherhood and loyalty. The street saw them as a formidable pair, the Don's son and his right-hand man. But in private, Alite began to see cracks in the foundation. The more Gotti Jr. tried to assert control, the more reckless the operations became. For Alite, this was more than business. It was survival. He had seen men vanish overnight for far less, a careless word, a misplaced dollar, a rumor. In the Gambino world, suspicion spread like wildfire, and one spark could end a man's life. Alite's sharp instincts kept him alive. He avoided unnecessary risks, distanced himself from certain deals, and made sure his operations were clean enough to withstand scrutiny. But paranoia became a silent companion. He noticed changes, whispers in the club, glances exchanged behind his back, people growing more cautious when he entered a room. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The underworld's golden rule was simple: the higher you climb, the more enemies you make. Still, Alite pressed on, driven by an unspoken code. He believed in loyalty, even when it wasn't returned. He believed in the family, even as it began to fracture from within. Nights bled into mornings filled with anxiety, his mind always calculating, who was talking, who was watching, who could be trusted. Queens became both his kingdom and his cage. He had power, yes, but it came with invisible chains. The same men who toasted his success could, at a moment's notice, be ordered to turn on him. Every handshake could conceal betrayal. Every laugh could hide suspicion. As the 1990s dawned, the FBI's pressure intensified, and internal rivalries grew sharper. Alite didn't know it yet, but the glory days of the Gambino family were nearing their end. And with that downfall would come his own reckoning, one that would test his loyalty, his courage, and ultimately, his very identity. The streets of Queens, once symbols of power and pride, were becoming a battlefield. And in that war of money, loyalty, and ego, even the most trusted men could fall. The game that had given John Alite everything was now beginning to turn against him, quietly, inevitably, and fatally. Power, at first, feels intoxicating, like an endless rush that makes you believe you're untouchable. For John Alite, the early 1990s were his high point. He had carved out an empire within the Gambino network, managing gambling operations, loans, and street collections that stretched from Queens to Tampa, Florida. He lived well, expensive suits, cars that gleamed under streetlights, and nights spent in the city's most exclusive clubs. To the outside world, he was the image of success, a man who had risen from nothing to command fear and respect. But behind that polished facade, cracks were beginning to form, and the very empire that made him powerful was slowly turning poisonous. The world around him was changing. Law enforcement had grown more sophisticated, and the Mafia's golden era was fading. Surveillance was everywhere, hidden microphones in restaurants, cameras tucked in corners of bars, agents listening to coded conversations that no longer fooled anyone. The FBI had learned the Mafia's language, its rhythms, its silence. And as the feds got smarter, the old codes of honor that once bound the families together began to dissolve. For Alite, the pressure was relentless. Each day brought new worries: who was being followed, who was talking, who might flip. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the sound of a car door outside enough to send his thoughts racing. In this life, fear wasn't an emotion, it was a survival tool. You learn to live with it, to listen to it, to never ignore its whisper. His relationship with John Gotti Jr. had shifted too. The friendship that once felt like brotherhood was now strained, overshadowed by ego and paranoia. Gotti Jr., stepping into his father's shoes, carried the arrogance of a prince born into power but not the discipline to sustain it. He made decisions that Alite disagreed with, risky moves, unnecessary displays of dominance, choices that drew attention from both rivals and law enforcement. Alite tried to guide him, to calm his impulses, but advice was no longer welcomed. "I got this," Gotti Jr. would say, brushing off concerns with the confidence of someone who had never truly felt the consequences of power. But Alite knew better. He had seen men like that before, men who believed the rules no longer applied to them, right up until the moment they were handcuffed. Meanwhile, the Teflon Don, John Gotti Sr., was facing his own battle. The government had built a case strong enough to pierce even his legendary reputation. In 1992, Gotti Sr. was sentenced to life in prison without parole. It was a seismic event in Mafia history. The man who had once been untouchable was now behind bars, and the ripple effect of his downfall changed everything. The Gambino family fractured, alliances shifted, and the FBI intensified its efforts to dismantle what remained. For Alite, the news was more than symbolic. It was personal. Gotti Sr. had been the anchor of their world, the one figure who commanded universal respect. With him gone, the family was adrift, and Gotti Jr., now acting boss, was struggling to maintain control. The power vacuum turned friends into competitors, loyalty into leverage. Everyone wanted to survive, and survival often meant betrayal. The streets of Queens grew tense. Old faces disappeared. New ones emerged, hungrier, more reckless, and often more dangerous. Meetings that once ended in laughter now ended in suspicion. Alite's instincts told him to keep his circle tight, to trust no one completely. Yet even that wasn't enough. The more he tried to stay ahead, the more isolated he became. He began splitting his time between New York and Florida, expanding his operations in hopes of creating a safety net, a fallback plan if things went bad up north. Tampa became his second home, a place where the rules were looser, the money cleaner, and the eyes of the FBI less watchful. But no matter how far he ran, the shadow of the Gotti name followed him. In private moments, Alite reflected on what he had built and what it had cost him. Nights alone in luxury hotel rooms began to feel emptier. The money, the respect, the fear he commanded, none of it quieted the unease in his chest. The streets had taught him that success was temporary, that every rise came with a fall. He had seen too many men disappear, not just killed, but erased, their names turned into warnings whispered over drinks. And then came the betrayal that stung deeper than any bullet. Rumors began to spread that Gotti Jr. was distancing himself from Alite. The same man who once called him brother now referred to him as an associate. It was a small change in language, but in the Mafia, words carried life and death weight. Alite understood what it meant. He was being quietly cut off. The inner circle was shrinking, and he was no longer part of it. The realization was devastating. Everything he had done, the risks, the violence, the loyalty, had been for a family that now saw him as expendable. It wasn't the betrayal itself that hurt most, it was the coldness behind it, the quiet erasure of a man who had once stood beside them. In those moments, lying awake in the quiet hours of early morning, Alite began to question everything. What did loyalty mean in a world where loyalty was traded like currency? What was power worth if it came with a target on your back? And, most hauntingly, what was left of the man he once was beneath the layers of fear and ruthlessness? The empire he had helped build was no longer a source of pride, it was a prison. Every decision he made felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The money still came in, the reputation still held, but deep down, Alite knew the tide was turning. The same forces that had lifted him up, ambition, loyalty, the Gotti name, were now conspiring to pull him down. And somewhere in that growing darkness, Alite began to sense that survival would soon mean something very different. It would no longer be about maintaining power or respect, it would be about staying alive long enough to escape the crumbling empire he had once called home. The deeper you went into the Mafia, the thinner the air became. Every friendship, every promise, every handshake came with hidden strings attached. For John Alite, this truth was becoming impossible to ignore. What had once been a world defined by loyalty and honor now felt like a chessboard where every move could end in betrayal. The streets whispered of shifting alliances, of men talking to the feds, of brothers turning on each other for survival. And Alite, the once trusted right hand of the Gotti heir, was beginning to realize that even he was not immune. It started with subtle signs. Men he had known for years began avoiding eye contact. Conversations stopped when he walked into a room. Meetings he should have been invited to were suddenly forgotten. Alite's instincts, sharpened by years of street survival, told him something was wrong. The Gambino family was changing, hardening, turning inward. The structure that had once seemed unshakable was now rotting from the inside out. The FBI's campaign against organized crime was relentless. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, had given prosecutors the power to turn one man's confession into a weapon that could dismantle entire families. And as the arrests piled up, the code of silence, the sacred omerta, began to crumble. Men who once swore they would die before talking began to reconsider when faced with the prospect of life sentences. Loyalty was fading, replaced by fear and desperation. John Gotti Sr.'s imprisonment had created a leadership vacuum that no one could truly fill. Gotti Jr. tried to step into his father's shoes, but the empire he inherited was fracturing under the weight of law enforcement pressure and internal disloyalty. To the FBI, he was the next big target. To many within the family, he was the reason the Gambinos were collapsing. And to Alite, he had become unpredictable, consumed by paranoia and pride. One night, in a dimly lit restaurant in Little Italy, Alite met with a few trusted associates. Over plates of pasta and quiet conversations, the tension was palpable. "The kid's losing it," one of them said, referring to Gotti Jr., "he's making enemies out of everyone." Alite didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his mind already racing. He had seen this before, men in power mistaking fear for respect. And in the Mafia, that confusion often ended in blood. Soon after, Alite began hearing rumors, dangerous ones. Word on the street was that Gotti Jr. had started questioning his loyalty. Some said he believed Alite was getting too independent, that he was keeping money from operations that should have gone to the family. It wasn't true, but in this world, perception mattered more than fact. Once suspicion took hold, it rarely let go. Alite tried to confront the issue directly. He met with Gotti Jr., attempting to clear the air. "We've been through too much for this kind of talk," Alite said calmly. But Gotti Jr. was cold, distant, his responses clipped and defensive. The trust between them, once unbreakable, was gone. "You do what you gotta do," Gotti Jr. said finally, his tone indifferent. It was a dismissal, not a reconciliation. Alite walked away from that meeting knowing something had changed forever. In the months that followed, he began to distance himself, carefully and quietly. He moved more of his operations to Florida, setting up businesses that could function independently of the Gambino network. But even as he tried to create space, the past refused to release him. He still owed allegiances, still carried secrets that tied him to men who no longer trusted him. Every phone call, every meeting, every familiar face brought new risks. And then came the unthinkable. One of Alite's close associates, a man he had considered loyal, was arrested and flipped. His testimony implicated several members of the family in racketeering and violent crimes. It was a betrayal that rippled through the underworld like a shockwave. Suddenly, no one knew who was talking and who wasn't. Everyone was a suspect. Alite's paranoia deepened. He began sleeping less, eating little, his mind constantly spinning with scenarios of betrayal. He started carrying 2 phones, changing cars frequently, avoiding familiar routines. In the Mafia, routine was death, and Alite had survived too long to make that mistake now. But the mental strain was wearing him down. The endless double life, part enforcer, part fugitive from his own people, was slowly unraveling him. The streets of Queens felt colder. Men who once greeted him warmly now kept their distance. Gotti Jr., in an effort to tighten control, was making reckless moves, eliminating anyone who could challenge his authority, even those who had once been allies. The paranoia was contagious. Trust had become a luxury no one could afford. In the quiet hours of the night, Alite often found himself replaying the past, the laughter, the victories, the sense of belonging that had once defined his life. He remembered the early days at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, the feeling of brotherhood that had drawn him in. It all felt like a different world now, one that had vanished beneath layers of fear and betrayal. He thought about walking away, leaving the life behind entirely. But leaving the Mafia wasn't like quitting a job. It was like trying to escape gravity. Every tie, every secret, every sin was a chain pulling him back. And deep down, Alite knew something else. Once the family started to see you as expendable, your only options were to run or die. As 1995 approached, the unspoken truth was clear, the code that had once bound them all was dead. Omerta was no longer sacred, and loyalty had become just another word men used until it no longer served them. The Mafia was eating itself from the inside, and Alite stood at the crossroads, torn between survival and a loyalty that no longer meant anything. He would soon have to make a choice, one that would change his life forever. Stay and face the inevitable, or walk away and become the very thing he had always despised, a man who broke the code. Either path came with a cost. But as the walls began closing in, Alite understood one thing with chilling clarity: in this life, betrayal wasn't an exception. It was the rule. By the mid-1990s, the world John Alite once ruled through loyalty and intimidation was collapsing around him. The Mafia's code of silence had cracked, the streets were whispering with betrayal, and law enforcement was tightening its noose around what was left of the Gambino family. The once glorious empire of the goddess was fracturing under paranoia, fear, and ambition. And caught at the center of it all was Alite, a man who had given everything for brotherhood, now realizing that brotherhood itself had become a death sentence. The shift began subtly, almost invisibly. Men who had once sworn loyalty were suddenly nowhere to be found. Rumors spread of quiet meetings with the FBI, of taped conversations, of confessions traded for leniency. Every time someone was arrested, the entire organization held its breath. Would he talk? Would he betray them all? The tension was unbearable, a slow, psychological torture that ate away at even the strongest minds. For Alite, it was personal. His entire identity had been built on the foundation of loyalty. He had believed in the brotherhood, the idea that honor existed even among criminals. It was a belief that had guided his every decision, justified every sin, every drop of blood spilled. But now, as the people he once called family began turning on each other, he was forced to confront the bitter truth: loyalty was only real until fear took over. The betrayal that hit the hardest came from within the Gotti circle. John Gotti Jr., the man Alite had once trusted like a brother, had turned cold. His tone changed, his words clipped and suspicious. He began distancing himself publicly, rewriting history in subtle ways, claiming Alite was never really one of them, that he was just an associate, a friend of convenience. For Alite, those words cut deeper than any bullet ever could. It wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. When Gotti Jr. began to feel the heat of the FBI closing in, he needed distance from anyone who could drag him down. Alite, despite his years of loyalty and service, was now a liability. To the goddess, he had become expendable. The betrayal was silent but unmistakable. Certain payments that had always come his way suddenly stopped. Messages that used to be direct were now delivered through intermediaries. His presence at family gatherings and meetings was no longer requested. In the underworld, such exclusions were death sentences written in whispers. Alite tried to keep calm, tried to convince himself that things would smooth over. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen it happen before: men exiled, isolated, and eventually eliminated once they outlived their usefulness. The realization came one night in Queens when an old friend warned him quietly, "Watch your back, Johnny. The streets are talking. You're not safe." It was advice Alite took seriously. He began moving cautiously, never staying in one place too long, never sitting with his back to a door. Every sound, every glance, every unexpected car in his rearview mirror set his nerves on edge. He was living like a ghost among men who once toasted him as a brother. The emotional toll was immense. Sleep became rare, food lost its taste. His thoughts circled endlessly around the same questions: how did it come to this? How could brotherhood turn so quickly into betrayal? He remembered the early days with Gotti Jr., the nights spent laughing, the shared dreams of power. It all seemed so far away now, like a story from another lifetime. The betrayal from Gotti Jr. wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal. Alite had risked everything for him: his freedom, his reputation, even his soul. He had kept secrets, enforced loyalty, and defended the Gotti name when others doubted it. Now that same name was being used to erase him, to discredit him, to make him disappear without a trace. But Alite wasn't naive. He understood that in the Mafia, betrayal was a currency, traded between men who feared death more than dishonor. Still, the sting of realizing that loyalty meant nothing left him hollow. For the first time in his life, he began to see the Mafia for what it truly was: not a family, but a machine, one that devoured its own the moment they ceased to be useful. As the betrayals piled up, the FBI's presence grew more visible. Raids became routine. Cars were seized, accounts frozen, homes searched. The media plastered headlines about the fall of the Gotti empire, about the once feared crime family now reduced to courtroom dramas and betrayals played out under oath. The streets that had once belonged to the Gambinos were now ruled by fear, not of rivals, but of the government and of each other. One night, Alite received word that one of his closest allies had been arrested and was considering turning state's evidence. The news hit him like a physical blow. He knew what it meant: his own name would soon surface in testimonies, in transcripts, in deals made behind closed doors. The walls were closing in. Still, Alite refused to panic. There was a strange calm that came with knowing the inevitable. He began preparing, setting aside money, arranging contacts overseas, quietly creating an exit plan. The streets had given him everything, but they had also taught him one lesson above all others: survival came first. His last meeting with Gotti Jr. was short, tense, and final. The man who had once been like a brother now looked at him with cold detachment. "We're going our separate ways," Gotti said, his tone flat. There were no threats, no raised voices, just an unspoken understanding that the bond they once shared was dead. Alite left that meeting knowing there was no going back. The betrayal was complete. The brotherhood he had built his life around was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. For the first time, he wasn't thinking like a gangster or an enforcer. He was thinking like a survivor. The streets that once echoed with laughter and deals now felt haunted. The old rules no longer applied. The code was broken, the family fractured, and Alite's only choice was to disappear before the same men he once protected came for him. The brotherhood had fallen, and with it, a part of John Alite died too, the part that believed in loyalty, in honor, in the romantic myth of the Mafia. What remained was a man stripped down to his instincts, facing a truth few gangsters ever lived long enough to understand. In the end, the only code that mattered was survival. After the betrayal and collapse of everything he once knew, John Alite did what few mobsters dared: he vanished. The man who had once walked the streets of Queens with a reputation that inspired both fear and admiration was now a fugitive, living between shadows and borders. He knew that staying in New York meant certain death, either from the feds or from the very men he once called brothers. So he disappeared into the folds of Europe, searching for refuge, identity, and perhaps, for the first time, peace. His flight took him across continents, from the busy avenues of Rio de Janeiro to the dark corners of Eastern Europe. He changed names, used forged documents, and lived out of suitcases and borrowed apartments. In Bulgaria, he lived like a ghost, sleeping with one eye open and a pistol never far from reach. He knew that the FBI was hunting him, that the Gotti family wanted him silenced, and that every day alive was a borrowed one. In exile, Alite's life was stripped of all the luxury and respect he once commanded. There were no more fancy suits, no expensive cars, no envelopes of cash waiting at the end of a job. He was just another foreigner on the run, a man reduced to survival. Yet, in that emptiness, something strange began to happen. For the first time since his youth, Alite was forced to confront the silence, to sit with his thoughts, his regrets, and the ghosts of the men whose lives he had destroyed. The nights were the hardest. The streets of Sofia were quiet, cold, and merciless. In the darkness, memories came flooding back, the screams, the laughter, the blood. He could still see the faces of those he had beaten, still hear the voices of those who had trusted him. It was during those sleepless hours that the illusion of the Mafia began to fade completely. The idea of honor among thieves, the brotherhood, the loyalty, it all felt like a cruel joke. The truth was that the life he had chosen didn't build men, it broke them. His exile lasted years. Every knock on the door sent his heart racing. Every unfamiliar face in a cafe looked like an agent in disguise. He learned to live with paranoia, it became as natural as breathing. He moved constantly, keeping his circle small, never trusting anyone for long. But deep inside, a quiet transformation was taking place. The anger that had once driven him began to dissolve, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. When Alite was finally captured and extradited, he didn't resist. There was no dramatic standoff, no final attempt to escape. He surrendered quietly, as if he had been waiting for this moment, not as an end, but as a release. Prison, for many, is a cage. But for Alite, it became something unexpected, a mirror. Behind bars, stripped of status, power, and wealth, he came face to face with the man he truly was. There was no more pretending, no audience to impress, no lie to maintain. Just Alite, the broken son of immigrants, the enforcer turned ghost, the man who had spent his life chasing power only to discover it meant nothing. In those gray prison walls, he began to change. He started reading, philosophy, religion, psychology, searching for answers, for redemption, for understanding. The same intensity that once made him a feared gangster now drove his hunger for truth. He wrote letters, filled journals, and slowly began to rebuild a sense of identity not rooted in violence or loyalty, but in reflection. He began to see his past not as a curse, but as a cautionary tale. The Mafia, he realized, was not a path to respect or brotherhood, it was a machine of destruction that devoured men from the inside out. Every promise it made, power, protection, belonging, was a lie designed to enslave those desperate enough to believe it. As his sentence dragged on, Alite started speaking with younger inmates. He told them stories, not the glorified kind that movies sell, but the brutal, honest truth. He spoke of betrayal, fear, and emptiness. He warned them that the streets offer only two endings, a cell or a coffin. Some listened, most didn't, but it didn't matter. For Alite, this was part of his redemption. When he was finally released, he emerged into a world that had forgotten him. The old Mafia was gone, replaced by new players, new rules. The names that once commanded fear were now footnotes in history books and FBI archives. But Alite didn't return to the shadows, he did something few ex-mobsters ever dared, he spoke out. He began giving interviews, writing books, sharing the truth about the life he once glorified. He didn't sugarcoat it or make excuses. He called out the hypocrisy, the corruption, and the human cost of the Mafia dream. Some called him a traitor, others a liar, but Alite didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't playing a role. He was free. The media dubbed him the mob rat who broke the code, but Alite saw it differently. He hadn't broken the code had broken him long ago. What he was doing now wasn't betrayal, it was confession. It was survival through honesty. Years later, when asked if he regretted turning against the goddess, Alite's answer was simple: they betrayed me first. I just stopped pretending we were ever family. That single line summed up a lifetime of violence, loyalty, and heartbreak. Today, Alite travels, speaks to schools, participates in documentaries, and warns young men about the seductive lie of organized crime. His words carry weight not because they come from a preacher or a politician, but from a man who's lived the darkness and crawled his way back out. In the end, John Alite's story is not just about the fall of a gangster, it's about the rebirth of a man. A man who learned that redemption doesn't erase the past, but transforms it into something useful, something human. He once lived by the sword, but now he lives by truth. And though the ghosts of his past still follow him, in the silence, in his memories, in the scars that never fade, he has found something rarer than power or money ever gave him: peace. Because in the end, every gangster learns the same lesson too late, that the real war was never on the streets. It was inside themselves. The year was 2008, and for John Alite, the walls had finally closed in. The man who once moved through the underworld with fearless precision now sat in a sterile interrogation room, hands cuffed, a cup of cold coffee on the table, and two FBI agents watching him closely. It was a moment that felt both like an ending and a beginning, the breaking point between the life he had built and the one he was about to choose. The decision to cooperate with the feds didn't come easily. For decades, Alite had lived by a code, twisted as it was, that demanded silence above all else. Omerta, they called it. The sacred vow of silence that defined what it meant to be a man of honor in the Mafia. Breaking it meant death, not just for you, but for anyone who bore your name. It was more than fear, it was cultural conditioning, the belief that loyalty was more important than truth. But loyalty, Alite realized, had already been betrayed. When he was captured, there was no rescue, no call from the family, no envelopes of money to support his loved ones. The goddess, who once celebrated his loyalty, now denied him entirely. He was expendable. Forgotten. Just another soldier sacrificed to protect the bosses. That realization, sharp, bitter, undeniable, broke something inside him that had held firm for decades. The feds didn't need to push hard. They had evidence, witnesses, and recordings. But more than that, they had time, and time, in a cold cell, does things to a man. Weeks turned into months, months into a quiet reckoning. Alite began to see cooperation not as betrayal, but as freedom, the first act of rebellion against a system that had used him like a weapon and discarded him like waste. When he finally agreed to talk, the agents were almost surprised. The man sitting across from them wasn't desperate or panicked, he was calm, deliberate, and eerily clear. Alite wasn't bargaining for leniency, he was reclaiming his narrative. If he was going down, he would do it on his terms, with truth as his only weapon. The debriefing stretched for hours, days, then weeks. He recounted everything, names, dates, locations, crimes that had long been buried under layers of silence and fear. He talked about the Gotti family's operations, about murders ordered in whispers, about extortion schemes that reached into the heart of New York nightlife. He exposed the way the family used loyalty as a leash, how fear kept men obedient, and how greed corroded every bond of trust. To the agents, Alite was a goldmine. He confirmed long-held suspicions, provided details that made old evidence suddenly relevant again, and opened windows into a world the FBI had struggled for decades to fully penetrate. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. With every confession, Alite was dismantling the mythology of the Mafia he had once glorified. Each word peeled away another layer of illusion until only the raw, ugly truth remained. The Gotti family, when they heard the news, erupted with fury. John Gotti Jr., in particular, would later go to trial, and Alite's testimony would become one of the most explosive elements in the case. The media loved it, the former Gotti enforcer turned government witness. It was betrayal on a Shakespearean scale, loyalty flipped into vengeance, power undone by truth. Alite knew the risks. Cooperation didn't just make him a witness, it made him a target. Even behind bars, word spread fast, and the underworld has a long memory. But by then, fear had lost its grip on him. He had spent years running, hiding, and bleeding for men who would never have done the same for him. Now, he was done running. "If they come for me," he once said, "at least I'll die as my own man, not someone else's pawn." When Alite took the stand, the courtroom was tense. He spoke with quiet authority, recounting in chilling detail how the Gotti crew extorted, assaulted, and killed. He didn't dramatize, he didn't need to. The calmness in his voice was what made it so haunting. The jurors listened, transfixed, as he described the rituals of violence, the coded messages, the false promises of family. Every word chipped away at the myth of the goddess as noble gangsters. The defense tried to discredit him, painting him as a liar, a self-serving criminal trying to save his own skin. But Alite didn't flinch. He admitted his crimes openly, almost clinically, and it was this brutal honesty that made him credible. "I'm not a saint," he said. "I'm here because I helped destroy lives, mine included. But I'm telling the truth now because the lies already cost too much." His cooperation played a crucial role in exposing the inner workings of the Gambino family's modern operations. He didn't just reveal what they did, he explained why they did it. He humanized the men behind the crimes, showing how fear, ego, and greed had replaced any sense of honor long ago. Outside the courtroom, the public watched with morbid fascination. To them, John Alite was the embodiment of contradiction, a violent man seeking peace, a traitor speaking truth, a gangster transformed into a philosopher of his own downfall. His interviews with journalists and his later public appearances would only deepen that paradox. But cooperation came with a price. In the underworld, his name was now synonymous with betrayal. Old friends became enemies, family ties dissolved, and death threats followed him wherever he went. He would live the rest of his life under constant vigilance, looking over his shoulder, moving from city to city, never fully at ease. And yet, in the quiet of his own conscience, Alite found something rare, relief. For the first time in decades, the secrets he carried weren't suffocating him. The burden of silence was gone. His voice, once used for intimidation, now carried a different kind of power, the power to expose, to educate, to prevent others from making the same choices he did. By cooperating with the feds, John Alite did more than betray a crime family, he broke a generational curse. He shattered the illusion that loyalty to evil is strength. He showed that true courage isn't found in silence or violence, but in the willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful. As his testimony concluded and the courtroom emptied, Alite sat quietly, his hands folded. The reporters outside shouted questions, the agents whispered congratulations, but he barely heard them. For him, the trial wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. He had torn down the house he once helped build, brick by brick, word by word. In that silence, something settled inside him, a strange mix of sorrow and peace. He wasn't the man he used to be. He wasn't even sure who he was now. But for the first time in his life, he was free, not from prison, not from fear, but from the lies that had once defined him. The cooperation with the feds wasn't the end of John Alite's story. It was the moment he stopped being a character in someone else's drama, and started writing his own truth. The courtroom lights glared down like interrogation lamps, and the air felt thick with history. This wasn't just another Mafia trial, it was a public reckoning of power, betrayal, and the ghosts of New York's underworld. John Alite sat in the witness stand, the same man who once served the Gotti Empire with ruthless loyalty, now staring down the remnants of that very dynasty. Across from him sat John Gotti, the son of the Dapper Don, the heir to the Teflon legacy, a man who had once been his closest ally. Now, they were adversaries, separated by the invisible line that divided truth from loyalty, freedom from silence. The courtroom itself felt like a stage, and every seat was filled. Reporters lined the benches, their pens ready to capture every glare, every word, every tremor in Alite's voice. The audience was there for blood, not literally, but for the kind of emotional spectacle that had always surrounded the Gotti name. The headlines had already written themselves, Gotti vs. Alite, the betrayal of the Gambino Brotherhood. When Alite took the oath, the room fell silent. His voice, low and steady, carried across the chamber with the weight of years, of violence, secrets, and guilt. I swore loyalty to the Gotti family, he began. I thought they were my brothers. But when I went down, they left me to rot. So now, I'm here to tell the truth. Not to destroy anyone, but to finally stop lying. It wasn't the words alone that captured the room, it was the tone. Calm, deliberate, almost haunting. The kind of voice that didn't need to prove itself because it came from someone who had lived every dark corner of what he spoke about. He recounted in painstaking detail the crimes he had committed under Gotti's command, the extortions, the beatings, the murders whispered about but never proven. He described clandestine meetings in Queens, envelopes of cash passed under tables, and orders delivered through coded phrases over steak dinners. The prosecution hung on his every word. For them, Alite was the key to unlocking decades of silence. He was the witness who could humanize the darkness, the insider who could make the abstract machinery of organized crime vivid and real. But for the defense, he was a traitor, a liar with an agenda, a man trying to save himself at the expense of others. John Gotti Jr. watched from his table, expression stoic, though his eyes never left Alite. The tension between them was palpable, the shared history, the years of brotherhood turned to ashes. There was no shouting, no outburst, just the heavy silence of two men who once trusted each other with their lives now standing on opposite sides of the same truth. The defense attorneys tried to dismantle Alite's credibility piece by piece. They pointed to his own crimes, his plea deals, his motives. They painted him as the ultimate opportunist, a killer looking for redemption only when it served him. But Alite's responses were measured, his honesty disarming. He didn't deny his guilt, he embraced it. I'm not here pretending to be a saint, he said. I did terrible things. But I did them under orders, and those orders came from the men sitting right there. Every time he spoke, the weight of his words rippled through the room. It wasn't the arrogance of a man trying to justify himself, it was the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much, done too much, and finally decided to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Outside the courtroom, the world was watching. The Gotti name still carried mystique, the glamorous facade of mob royalty that had once fascinated America. But Alite's testimony peeled that illusion apart. He described not loyalty and power, but fear and control. He painted the Mafia not as a code of honor, but as a web of manipulation and greed. "There's no honor in that life," he told the jury. "It's just pain wearing a gold chain." The trial dragged on for months, and with each day, the psychological battle deepened. For Alite, testifying wasn't just about cooperation, it was confrontation. He wasn't just facing the feds, the press, or the public, he was facing his own past. Every name he mentioned, every story he told, was another ghost resurrected. There were moments when his voice faltered, when the images were too heavy to articulate. But he always found his way back, calm, steady, unflinching. For Gotti Jr., the trial became a stage for defiance. He denied the accusations, painting himself as a man trying to escape his father's shadow, a target of government obsession. He smiled for cameras, adjusted his tie, and let his lawyers do the fighting. But beneath the polished exterior, the cracks were visible. The once mighty Gotti family was no longer the untouchable empire it had been. The Teflon had finally begun to peel away. In the final weeks of testimony, Alite spoke about the toll the life had taken, on him, on his family, on the countless victims caught in its wake. He admitted to guilt and regret but also to a strange sense of liberation. "The truth doesn't set you free," he said quietly once, "it just stops you from dying in silence." Those words lingered long after he left the stand. When the verdict finally came, it was mixed. Gotti Jr. would once again escape full conviction, the jury deadlocked, the government's case fractured by years of mistrust and legal fatigue. But the symbolic victory wasn't his. The empire he represented was gone. The myth of the Gotti name, the illusion of the untouchable Don, had been dismantled not by bullets or betrayals in the dark, but by a single man's testimony under oath. For Alite, there was no triumph in that outcome. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. When reporters tried to get a quote, he simply said, "It's over, for all of us." And in a way, it was. The courtroom doors closed not just on a trial, but on an era, the last echoes of an empire built on fear and charisma, now reduced to transcripts and memories. In the quiet after the storm, Alite walked out of the courthouse into a gray Manhattan afternoon. The city around him buzzed with the same energy it always had, indifferent to the personal wars fought within its walls. For him, the trial was not vindication, it was closure. He had faced the ghosts, spoken the truth, and survived the fire. Yet deep down, he knew that survival was not freedom. The Mafia had a long reach, and even if its empire had crumbled, its echoes would follow him for life. But as he disappeared into the crowd, head lowered, step steady, one truth rang clear: John Alite had done the unthinkable. He had faced the empire he once served, and lived to tell the tale. When the trial ended, and the echo of the gavel faded into memory, John Alite stepped out into a world that no longer belonged to him. The courthouse doors swung shut behind him, and for the first time in decades, there were no soldiers at his side, no allies waiting in a black sedan, no whispers of plans or payoffs. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it hums with uncertainty, with the knowledge that everything you were is gone, and what comes next is unclear. For years, Alite had lived under a set of rules so strict, so absolute, that they had become second nature: never talk, never trust, never show fear. But now, those same rules no longer applied. The code he had lived by was shattered the moment he took the stand. There was no going back, not to the streets, not to the life, and certainly not to the people who once called him brother. His name, once whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the bars and back rooms of Queens, was now a curse among old associates. Rat. The word alone carried the sting of death in their world. It wasn't just a label, it was a sentence. Even though the Mafia's reach was weaker than in its golden years, vengeance had no expiration date. Alite knew that if anyone still loyal to the goddess saw him, the old rules would still apply. He lived cautiously, sometimes under assumed names, sometimes in quiet neighborhoods where nobody asked questions. The once proud enforcer who strode through nightclubs and city streets now moved like a shadow through quiet suburbs and anonymous motels. Every sound behind him made him turn his head. Every unfamiliar car parked near his home became a possible threat. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. But beneath the fear, something else was beginning to grow: peace. Fragile at first, but real. For the first time, Alite didn't have to perform, didn't have to live up to the myth of toughness, of control, of dominance. He didn't have to be the man everyone else feared. He could just exist, quietly, as himself. He spent hours writing, journaling about his past, not to relive it, but to understand it. Each sentence became a small act of release. He began to see his memories not as trophies or warnings, but as lessons. The violence, the greed, the endless cycles of revenge, it all seemed hollow now, childish almost, like the remnants of a nightmare that once felt real but now felt impossibly distant. Still, the scars remained, not just physical, but emotional. Nights were the hardest. The silence that brought peace during the day turned heavy after dark. The memories came back then, the sound of gunshots echoing in alleys, the faces of men who trusted him, the women who cried when they realized what kind of man he really was. Sleep never came easy. And when it did, it was haunted. There were moments when he'd wake up drenched in sweat, the past clawing its way back through dreams. He'd sit by the window, watching the lights of the city he once ruled flicker in the distance, and wonder if redemption was even possible for a man like him. Could a life built on blood ever truly be washed clean? Or was this quiet life, this exile in plain sight, the only kind of forgiveness he'd ever get? The FBI had offered protection, but Alite declined the witness protection program. He didn't want to live hidden behind another man's name. "I've been hiding my whole life," he once said in an interview. "I'm done being a ghost." Instead, he chose to face the world as John Alite, the man who had sinned, betrayed, and survived. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he wasn't ashamed of telling the truth either. He began to speak publicly, cautiously at first, small interviews, a podcast appearance, a quote here and there. The public's reaction was mixed. Some saw him as a hypocrite, a killer turned storyteller, profiting off the very life he destroyed. Others saw him as something different, a rare voice from the inside, someone willing to strip away the romanticism that had long surrounded organized crime. Alite didn't glamorize it. His words were measured, reflective, almost tired. "People think the Mafia is loyalty and family," he'd say. "It's not. It's greed and fear wearing nice suits." Each time he spoke, it was as if he was cutting another thread that tied him to his old identity. The truth, in its quiet repetition, became his therapy. Still, redemption was not a straight path. There were days when the guilt felt unbearable, the memories of those he had hurt, the families shattered, the friends lost. He couldn't make amends to most of them, they were gone, or beyond forgiveness. So he focused on what he could do, telling the truth, warning others, using his story as a cautionary tale. He visited schools and community centers, speaking to young people tempted by the allure of fast money and street respect. He told them not about power, but about loss, the years wasted, the loneliness, the betrayal. Some listened. Some didn't. But every time he spoke, he felt a little lighter, as if each confession burned away a piece of his past. He also started reconnecting with his family, the few who hadn't abandoned him. The process was slow, fragile, but healing. He wasn't the same father, the same brother, the same son. The walls that violence had built around him were finally cracking, and through them came moments of tenderness he hadn't felt in years. The sound of laughter at a dinner table, the quiet of ordinary life, those became his new treasures. Yet, even as he tried to build a new life, Alite understood that he could never fully escape his old one. The past doesn't fade, it waits. Sometimes it found him in unexpected ways, an old associate spotted at a restaurant, a familiar name whispered in an airport terminal, a message online reminding him that some debts never expire. But instead of fear, Alite met those moments with acceptance. The man he used to be would have fought or fled. The man he had become simply nodded and moved on. He was no longer chasing absolution. He knew it wasn't his to demand. What he sought instead was purpose, a reason to keep moving forward, to turn the wreckage of his past into something that might prevent others from following the same path. In his solitude, John Alite discovered a truth deeper than any he'd spoken in court: redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. It's about facing it, every ugly, brutal part, and choosing to live differently, even when the world refuses to forgive you. The world had moved on from the Mafia he once served. The streets he once ruled had new kings, new players, new rules. But somewhere, in a quiet corner of that same city, an old enforcer sat by his window, the hum of distant traffic replacing the sound of gunfire, and allowed himself, for the first time, to breathe. Because in that breath was freedom, fragile, imperfect, and real. As the years passed, the name John Alite began to shift from tabloid headlines to a kind of grim legend, a figure caught between the dark romance of mob mythology and the uncomfortable truth of what that world truly was. His story lingered in podcasts, documentaries, and books, a reminder that the Mafia's golden age was long gone, replaced by a generation fascinated with its ghosts. Yet behind the media fascination, Alite's reality remained simple: a man alone with his memories, trying to find meaning after decades spent in darkness. Time had softened his face, but not his eyes. They still carried that sharpness, the same watchfulness that had kept him alive in alleys, bars, and back rooms. But now, it wasn't paranoia that made him alert. It was awareness, an understanding of how fragile peace really was. He had seen the world at its cruelest, and yet somehow survived long enough to witness it change. When Alite spoke at schools or rehabilitation centers, the room often fell into a heavy silence. The students expected to hear stories of gunfights and money, the cinematic kind of crime that fills Hollywood screens. But instead, he talked about pain. About the look in a mother's eyes when she realized her son was gone forever. About the emptiness of standing in a mansion filled with money you can't spend without fear. About the sound of your own conscience catching up to you in the dark. The truth is, he'd say quietly, the streets don't love you. They use you. And when you're gone, they forget you. For many, those words carried more weight than all the threats he had ever made with a gun in his hand. He wasn't a hero, he didn't pretend to be one. He was a mirror. A living reflection of what power, greed, and misplaced loyalty could turn a man into. But as much as he wanted to move forward, the past refused to stay buried. Documentaries resurfaced old footage of him, standing beside powerful men, smiling in tailored suits. Former associates wrote books or gave interviews, some accusing him of exaggeration, others defending him. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the middle, tangled, subjective, human. Alite never denied what he'd done. He only asked to be judged as he was now, not as he had been. One of his greatest regrets was the damage his choices had inflicted on his own family. The years of absence, the fear his loved ones lived with, the shadow that followed them long after he had left the life. He spoke often about trying to repair those bonds, not through grand gestures, but through presence. A father's voice on the phone, a visit, a birthday remembered. Each small act became a brick in the quiet rebuilding of his soul. In interviews, when asked what redemption meant to him, Alite often paused before answering. It's not forgiveness, he'd say softly. It's responsibility. You don't get forgiven for what you've done. You carry it. Every day. But if you can use that weight to keep someone else from falling, then maybe it starts to mean something. He began writing more, not just about the Mafia, but about fear, morality, and the psychology of violence. His reflections weren't the boasts of a former criminal seeking fame, they were the writings of a man dissecting his own past, piece by piece. Each page carried a mix of pain and wisdom, as though he was still testifying, this time, not in front of a jury, but before history itself. And history, it seemed, was ready to listen. Younger generations, raised on streaming shows about gangsters and antiheroes, were surprised by how different Alite's message was. He didn't romanticize his story, he dismantled it. He reminded them that for every one man who rose to power in that world, a dozen others were buried nameless beneath it. That the honor and loyalty of the Mafia were just illusions, tools used to manipulate desperate men into dying for other people's greed. Yet, paradoxically, his honesty made him something the Mafia had always claimed to value, a man who told the truth, no matter the cost. By the time Alite reached his later years, he had accepted that he would always live under the shadow of who he once was. But he also came to see that shadow as proof of his survival. "You can't outrun your past," he said once. "But you can walk beside it, if you learn not to let it lead you." In moments of solitude, he sometimes returned to the places that had once defined him, not to relive them, but to reclaim them. The streets of Queens. The dimly lit bars of Ozone Park. The quiet cemeteries where so many of his friends now rested. He would stand there for a while, silent, the wind whispering through the trees, and feel the strange mix of grief and gratitude that only survivors understand. He knew the end would come quietly. Not with a bullet or betrayal, but with time, the slow erosion of memory. And when it did, he hoped people would remember him not as a gangster, not as a rat, but as a warning, a man who walked through hell and came back to tell others what it looked like. Because in the end, his greatest act of defiance wasn't violence, or survival, or even testimony. It was transformation. The decision to stop living by the code of silence and start living by the code of truth. As night fell on his final years, Alite would sometimes sit by the window, the same ritual he had kept since leaving the life, and watch the city lights flicker in the distance. The world had changed. The mob was no longer the empire it once was. The names that had once ruled it were fading into history. But somewhere, between the echoes of that lost world and the quiet hum of the present, his story endured, not as a celebration, but as a cautionary tale about power, pride, and the price of survival. He had once lived by the gun. Then by the truth. And in the end, it was the truth that set him free, not from his past, but from the man he used to be. Because perhaps the greatest legacy of all is not the fear you leave behind, but the lesson your darkness teaches the light. The day John Alite decided to betray the Gotti family wasn't marked by fireworks, bloodshed, or a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of silence that hums in the background of betrayal, like the pause between a confession and the first tear. After decades of loyalty, violence, and blind faith, Alite finally realized the truth that so many mobsters deny until it's too late. In the world of organized crime, loyalty only flows one way, upward. It didn't happen overnight. The seeds had been planted years earlier, when Alite noticed the double standards that defined the Gotti regime. The very men who preached loyalty were the first to turn their backs when it suited them. Alite had taken bullets, served time, and carried out orders without question. Yet, when the storm came down, he was left exposed, a soldier in a war where his generals had already fled the battlefield. The first cracks appeared during his years in South America. After escaping to Brazil, Alite had expected the Gotti network to protect him, to help him survive while the law hunted him. Instead, he found silence. Money stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. He was on his own, hunted not only by the FBI but by the very men he had once sworn his life to. Sitting in a small Brazilian apartment, sweating through the humid nights, he realized. What every mobster eventually learns, you're only as valuable as your last favor. Betrayal, for Alite, was not a sudden act of treachery, it was an act of survival. When the FBI finally caught up to him, the choice was stark and merciless. The feds didn't need to threaten him, the betrayal had already been done. He was expendable. Disposable. And if he didn't talk, he'd die in a cell, forgotten by the very people he had once bled for. It was then that Alite made the decision that would brand him forever, to cooperate. To tell the truth, not for revenge, but because silence no longer served a purpose. He had lived the Mafia code, and it had cost him everything. Now, he would rewrite the ending. The Gotti family, particularly John Gotti Jr., took his cooperation as a personal insult, a stain on their name. In the world of the Mafia, betrayal isn't just disloyalty, it's blasphemy. Alite's testimony became a weapon, one that helped dismantle what was left of the Gotti empire. In court, he painted a picture of the inner workings of the Gambino family that no outsider had ever seen so clearly. Names, dates, deals, the web of power and deceit that had kept the family afloat for decades unraveled under his words. But his betrayal wasn't driven by vengeance. It was driven by clarity. He had seen the hypocrisy for what it was, a system built on illusion. The family wasn't family. It was a business. And when the profits dried up, so did the love. The same men who once toasted him at tables lined with cash and champagne now cursed his name, calling him a rat. But Alite had already accepted that label. He wore it not as shame, but as armor. Behind closed doors, federal agents were stunned by his candor. Unlike many mob informants who shaded their stories or hid behind excuses, Alite confessed openly. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He admitted to violence, to greed, to moral blindness. He didn't seek redemption through denial, he sought it through truth. He told them about the hits he'd planned, the rackets he'd run, the deals made in dimly lit rooms that ended in blood. But he also spoke of the guilt that had followed him, the sleepless nights, the faces that haunted him. His cooperation was more than legal, it was spiritual. The act of confession, after a lifetime of secrecy, gave him something he hadn't felt in years, peace. Still, outside the courtroom, his betrayal became legend. To some, he was the ultimate traitor, a man who had turned on the Gotti dynasty. To others, he was a realist, someone who had the courage to admit that the Mafia dream was a lie. The streets whispered his name with a mixture of fear and fascination. He was living proof that no code, no oath, no blood pact was unbreakable. The goddess retaliated not with bullets, but with words. John Gotti Jr. called him a liar, a coward, a man who exaggerated his role in the family. They launched smear campaigns, gave interviews, and tried to erase him from the story. But the courts believed him. The FBI believed him. And perhaps most importantly, time believed him. As the years passed, evidence surfaced that supported much of what he had said. The myth of the unbreakable Mafia code began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Yet, betrayal came at a price. Alite lost more than the respect of the underworld, he lost his sense of belonging. For decades, he had defined himself by his place in that hierarchy, by the power he held in the shadows. Now, he was an exile from his own past, a man untethered. In quiet moments, he would reflect on the irony of it all. They called me a rat, he once said in an interview. But they were already eating each other alive. I just stopped pretending. The betrayal that once seemed so definitive had, over time, evolved into something deeper, a transformation. Alite didn't betray the Mafia out of weakness, he did it because he finally saw it for what it was. He had believed in honor, loyalty, brotherhood, but those ideals were long dead, buried beneath greed and fear. What he betrayed wasn't the family. It was the illusion of family. And as he stepped out of the courtroom that final day, a free man for the first time in decades, he realized that betrayal and freedom are sometimes the same thing, painful, necessary, and irrevocable. In the end, the betrayal that damned him in the eyes of his old world was the very thing that allowed him to enter a new one. Because only when you've lost everything, your power, your name, your friends, can you finally see what was real all along? For John Alite, betrayal wasn't the end of loyalty. It was the beginning of truth. The courtroom was colder than Alite expected. Not in temperature, but in spirit, a hollow, echoing chamber where lives were dissected under fluorescent light. As he stepped onto the witness stand, he knew the world outside was watching. Reporters filled the benches, notebooks open like weapons. Former allies glared at him from across the room. Somewhere, behind those walls, the Gotti name still carried power. But here, inside this federal courtroom, it was the truth that ruled, and John Alite was about to speak it. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the faces before him, and felt the weight of decades settle on his shoulders. He was no longer a street enforcer, no longer the muscle that people feared. He was something far more dangerous now, a man with nothing left to lose. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Alite, can you tell the court what your relationship was with John Gotti Jr.? That question was the key that opened everything. Alite began to speak, calmly and deliberately. He painted a picture of the world behind closed doors, the unspoken hierarchy, the whispers in back rooms, the coded glances exchanged over espresso cups. He described the violence that existed beneath the surface of glamour. The collections, the extortions, the hits that never made the newspapers. Every word was a crack in the facade that the Mafia had built for decades. He didn't speak with pride. There was no glory in his tone. Instead, he spoke with the stillness of a man recounting a nightmare, not to boast, but to finally wake up from it. He told the court how loyalty had been a weapon, used to control men like him. How he had carried out orders he didn't question, because in their world, obedience was survival. "We thought we were family," he said quietly. "But in the end, we were pawns." Across the room, defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Gotti Jr. sat impassive, his eyes hard as glass. The cameras focused on every flicker of emotion, every pause between words. When Alite recounted specific moments, violent acts, money laundering, secret meetings, the courtroom hung in silence. His voice was calm, but his words carried the force of a confession years in the making. He didn't hide his own guilt. In fact, he embraced it. "I'm not innocent," he told the jury. "But I'm not lying, either. I've done things I'll never forget. I just want to tell the truth about what we all became." Each session stretched for hours. Days turned into weeks. Reporters started calling him, the rat who knew too much. But to those who listened closely, there was something else in his testimony, a rare honesty that cut through the usual mob mythology. He spoke about the contradictions of that life, how men who preached loyalty cheated, lied, and betrayed one another constantly. How the ones who bragged about honor were often the first to run when things went bad. And how the younger generation of gangsters, lured by easy money and reputation, didn't understand that the Mafia was already dying. The defense tried to tear him apart. They questioned his motives, his credibility, his sanity. They called him a liar, an opportunist, a bitter man seeking revenge. But Alite remained composed. He had lived through worse than cross-examination, he had lived through ambushes, betrayals, and the paranoia of his own crew turning on him. At one point, when asked if he regretted cooperating, Alite paused, looked directly at the defense table, and said, "No. Because at least now, I can look in the mirror without seeing a ghost." The statement landed like a gunshot in the room. For the first time, people saw not a monster, but a man, one deeply scarred, but self-aware. A man who had clawed his way out of darkness not for revenge, but for redemption. Each confession revealed more than just facts. It exposed the psychology of the Mafia, the fear, the manipulation, the brotherhood built on sand. The jury listened not just to crimes, but to a culture of deceit that stretched back generations. When Alite described the rituals, the oath, the candles, the blood on the saint's card, he did so without mystique. It wasn't sacred, he said. It was business dressed up like religion. They told us we were part of something bigger, but it was just another lie. His testimony pulled back the curtain on one of America's most notorious families, and in doing so, he shattered the illusion that had captivated the public for decades. The Gotti name, once synonymous with untouchable power, was now tied to a story of betrayal, corruption, and downfall. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Headlines screamed of "Mob Rat Confesses All." For every truth Alite spoke, a dozen rumors followed. He was hated by the old world and misunderstood by the new one. Yet, somewhere in between, people began to see him differently, as a cautionary voice rather than a villain. Inside his hotel room each night, Alite would sit by the window, staring at the city lights. He thought about the men he'd known, the ones dead, the ones imprisoned, the ones still pretending the life was worth something. He thought about his own survival, how it had cost him everything but his conscience. When the trial finally ended, and the jury reached its verdict, the Mafia as he knew it was no more. The code of silence had been broken. The untouchable families were now ghosts of their former selves, haunted by their own secrets. For Alite, walking out of that courtroom was like walking out of a coffin. The past would follow him forever, but for the first time, he could breathe. He had faced his demons not in the dark, but under the blinding light of truth. And though the world branded him a traitor, he knew the truth: he had only betrayed a lie. The real betrayal had been the one that life itself demanded, loyalty to a system that devoured its own sons. From that day forward, the Mafia would never be the same. Because once a man like John Alite speaks, once the silence is broken, the echo never fades. Freedom, as John Alite quickly learned, didn't feel like freedom at all. The courtroom doors had closed behind him, the cameras had turned away, and the reporters had moved on to fresher scandals. But when he stepped back into the world, there was no applause, no closure, only silence. The streets that had once bowed to him no longer recognized his face. The underworld whispered his name like a curse, while the ordinary world eyed him with suspicion. He was free by law, but imprisoned by memory. In those early years after his testimony, Alite lived like a ghost. He drifted between cities under assumed names, always watching over his shoulder. There was no trust left in him, not for others, and not even for himself. He had betrayed the life he once swore to uphold, and that act, whether seen as courage or cowardice, had cut him off from both worlds. The Mafia wouldn't forgive him, and society wouldn't forget him. At night, he often found himself awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the same recurring image: faces from the past. The men he had grown up with. The ones he'd fought beside, and the ones he'd helped bury. Each name was a memory, and each memory a wound. Some he missed, others he regretted, but most of all, he mourned the years he had wasted believing in a dream that had never been real. There were moments when he thought about disappearing completely, changing his name, vanishing into another country, living out his days in anonymity. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps guilt. He couldn't erase his past, and deep down, he knew that running from it wouldn't bring peace. The only way to silence the ghosts was to face them. So, Alite began to write. It started as a private exercise, notes scribbled on scraps of paper, recollections of moments he couldn't shake. But those words soon took on a rhythm of their own, like confessions whispered into the night. He wrote about fear, about betrayal, about what it truly meant to live without trust. He wrote not to justify himself, but to understand himself. Over time, those pages became the blueprint for something larger, a chance to tell his story his way, before others continued to twist it. He began working with journalists, podcasters, and eventually co-authors. Each interview was both a risk and a release. The Mafia code of silence might have been broken, but the danger was still real. Old enemies didn't forgive, and even some law enforcement figures doubted his sincerity. But the more Alite spoke, the lighter he became. The truth, once his enemy, had become his therapy. Yet, the public's reaction was complex. Some called him brave, a man who dared to break free from an evil system. Others saw him as irredeemable, a killer trying to cleanse his sins with words. Alite understood both sides. People want to believe in redemption, he said once, but they don't really know what it costs. He found small comforts in ordinary life. The sound of morning traffic, the smell of coffee in a quiet kitchen, the laughter of children on a sidewalk. Simple things he had ignored when he was too busy chasing power. Every sunrise became a reminder that he had survived. But survival, he realized, wasn't the same as living. There were moments of loneliness so deep they bordered on despair. He had outlived friends, enemies, and even the world that had once defined him. When he walked down certain streets in Queens or Manhattan, memories would flood him, the clink of glasses in old bars, the coded conversations in back rooms, the heavy silence before a hit. The ghosts never left, they just grew quieter. In time, Alite began reaching out to others who were trapped in cycles of violence. Ex-gang members, addicts, troubled youth, people walking the same razor's edge he once had. When he spoke to them, it wasn't from a pedestal. He didn't preach. He told stories. Real stories. Stories about choices, and how quickly one bad decision could become a lifetime sentence. In one talk, he said softly, "I used to think power meant making people fear you. Now I know real power is being able to forgive yourself enough to change." The room was silent. Some nodded. Some cried. For the first time, his words did something his gun never could, they saved someone. But even as he tried to rebuild, he knew that a part of him would always belong to the shadows. The habits of paranoia never fully faded. He still checked the rearview mirror twice. Still avoided crowded places. Still slept with one ear open. Years of living under the Mafia's invisible law had rewired him in ways that could never be undone. The media occasionally dragged him back into the spotlight, especially when a new documentary or court case revived interest in the Gotti saga. Some portrayed him as a reformed man, others as an opportunist. Alite didn't argue. He had learned that you can't control how others see you. You can only control what you do next. As he aged, his perspective softened. He no longer saw the world in terms of enemies and allies, power and weakness. Instead, he saw it as a series of choices, each one shaping the man he was becoming. He still carried the scars of his past, but now, they served a purpose, to remind him where not to return. He once said, "The hardest part isn't leaving the life. It's learning how to live after it." Those ghost years, silent, lonely, uncertain, became the crucible in which his redemption was forged. It was a time when he lost almost everything but gained the one thing that mattered, perspective. He had been a soldier, a fugitive, a witness, and a traitor. Now, he was simply a man trying to understand what it meant to be human again. And though the world had moved on, and the streets no longer whispered his name, the ghosts never fully left him. They lingered at the edge of every quiet night, reminding him of who he had been, and who he had chosen to become. But in those echoes, he found something unexpected. Not fear. Not regret. Peace. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come with applause or forgiveness. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet moments between the ghosts. The night was quiet in Queens, but John Alite's mind was anything but. For years, he had walked the tightrope between loyalty and survival, serving the Gotti family with the precision of a soldier and the devotion of a brother. Yet deep inside, cracks had begun to form, subtle at first, but growing wider with every betrayal, every lie, and every secret whispered in the shadows of Rave Night Social Club. By the early 1990s, the world that once felt invincible was beginning to crumble. The government had intensified its assault on organized crime, using the RICO Act to dismantle entire families from the inside. The Gambino family was no longer the untouchable empire it had once been. Informants emerged like ghosts in the dark, testifying in courtrooms, pointing fingers, and trading honor for immunity. For a man like Alite, who had built his identity on loyalty, the realization that the brotherhood was corroding from within was a slow and painful awakening. He began to notice the small betrayals, envelopes coming up light, whispers that stopped when he entered a room, strange eyes watching him from cars parked too long at the curb. There was a new kind of fear in the streets, not from rival gangs or law enforcement, but from the one sitting across the table. Trust had become a currency rarer than gold. Alite's instincts, once sharp and reliable, now screamed warnings he couldn't ignore. And then came the moment that changed everything, a secret meeting, a conversation overheard, and a truth that struck like lightning. Someone inside the Gotti circle had begun to question Alite's loyalty. The accusations were quiet but deadly. "He's making too much," one man whispered. "He's getting soft," said another. And in the world of the Mafia, perception was everything. You didn't need to betray anyone to be marked for death, you just needed to look like you might. The realization hit him hard, he was no longer protected by his loyalty. He was now a potential target. John Gotti Jr., the man he once called brother, was changing too. The pressures of leadership, paranoia, and federal attention had made him colder, more calculating. The camaraderie of the early days was gone, replaced by suspicion and resentment. Alite replayed their conversations in his mind, the ones that had once felt like plans between brothers, now tainted with hidden meanings. He began to recognize a pattern, Gotti Jr. distancing himself, sending others to deliver messages, skipping meetings, keeping him out of critical operations. Alite knew enough about the streets to understand what this meant. He was being quietly exiled. And in the Mafia, exile was the first step toward elimination. The streets spoke in code, and Alite knew how to listen. A friend warned him to lay low for a while. Another suggested he take a vacation. Simple phrases, but he knew what they meant. He was being set up to disappear, quietly, efficiently, without a trace. Every night became a test of nerves. The sound of footsteps behind him could be nothing, or it could be everything. He changed his routes, watched his mirrors, and slept with a gun on the nightstand. The loyalty that once defined him was now the very thing that endangered him. He had given his life to the family, and now the family might take it away. But betrayal has a strange way of transforming a man. It hardens some, destroys others, and awakens a few. For John Alite, it sparked something deeper, a realization that the code he had lived by was a myth. The honor, the loyalty, the silence, they were all illusions that protected the powerful and devoured the faithful. In that darkness, he found clarity. The streets had taught him survival, and survival now meant thinking the unthinkable, turning his back on the very world that had created him. Yet even as the idea formed in his mind, it was accompanied by guilt, a deep, gnawing guilt that tore at his soul. To betray the Mafia was to betray everything he had ever believed in. But what if the Mafia had betrayed him first? That thought stayed with him like a whisper he couldn't silence. Each night, as he stared out at the city skyline, the same skyline that had witnessed his rise, he wondered how it had come to this. How the boy from Queens who once dreamed of power and brotherhood had become a hunted man, haunted by the ghosts of his own loyalty. There were still people he cared about, old friends, family, faces from the neighborhood who would never understand his turmoil. But Alite knew one truth above all others: in the world he lived in, no one stayed clean forever. Everyone was either a traitor or a victim. As he loaded his gun and checked the locks on his door, he realized he had reached a crossroads. One path led to loyalty and certain death. The other led to survival, and a new kind of life, one he could barely imagine. Outside, the streets of New York were silent, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Inside, John Alite sat in the dim light, the weight of his choices pressing down like a storm. The seeds of betrayal had been planted long ago. Now, they were beginning to bloom. And soon, he would have to decide what kind of man he truly was: the loyal soldier who died for a fading empire, or the survivor who dared to walk away from it. The moment finally came quietly, without ceremony or warning, not in a gunfight, not in a courtroom, but in a decision made in the stillness of one sleepless night. John Alite had spent years living by a code that demanded loyalty, silence, and obedience. But that night, as rain tapped softly against the window of a safe house somewhere in Florida, he realized that the code had already died long before he even thought of breaking it. What remained was survival, and survival required a different kind of courage. For months, the net had been tightening. Federal agents had been circling closer, gathering witnesses, tracking calls, building a case that reached into every corner of the Gambino network. One by one, old allies disappeared into custody, and the rest vanished into silence. When word reached Alite that indictments were coming, he didn't wait to see his name on the list. Instead, he packed a small bag, took the cash he'd stashed away for emergencies, and slipped out of the country. He landed in Brazil, a place that felt as far from New York as another planet. The air was heavy with humidity, the sound of the ocean in the distance a strange comfort to a man used to the noise of the city. For the first time in decades, Alite was truly alone. No soldiers. No orders. No Gotti family watching over his shoulder. Just a man and the ghosts of his past. At first, he told himself it was temporary, just until things cooled down. But as days turned to months, and the faces from home became names in headlines, he began to see his escape for what it really was, a quiet rebellion. He had walked away from the life, something few men dared to do and even fewer survived. But even in exile, he couldn't escape the shadows of what he'd done. The memories followed him everywhere, the hits, the betrayals, the deals sealed in backrooms. He spent his nights in dim bars, staring into glasses of dark liquor and replaying his past like an old film. Sometimes he'd catch himself glancing at every door, still expecting trouble, still wired for danger. Old instincts die hard. Yet beneath the paranoia was something new, an uneasy peace. The kind that comes when you know you've already lived through your worst days. But the peace didn't last. In 2004, his past finally caught up with him. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds of his apartment in Rio de Janeiro, there was a knock at the door. Not the kind that comes from friends. When he opened it, there were men in suits, local police, backed by U.S. Marshals. His time as a fugitive had ended. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No fight, no chase. Just a man nodding, sighing, and accepting that his running days were over. As they led him away, he didn't feel anger or fear. Just an emptiness, and maybe, somewhere deep down, relief. Back in the U.S., the reality of what awaited him was crushing. Dozens of charges, the possibility of decades behind bars, and a name that was already being whispered in the same breath as traitors and informants. But John Alite wasn't stupid. He knew how the game was played. The Mafia had no loyalty left, and the system had no mercy. So, he made the decision that would define him for the rest of his life: he would talk. The first time he sat down with federal agents, there was no drama, just a deep, exhausted truth. He told them everything he knew, every deal, every murder, every betrayal. Not to boast, but to finally unburden himself from a lifetime of lies. It wasn't easy. Each confession was a blade cutting through years of silence. But with every story told, the weight lifted just a little more. The world he had built was collapsing anyway. The Gotti name no longer carried the power it once did. John Gotti Sr. was dead, Gotti Jr. was tangled in legal wars, and the family empire was a shadow of itself. Alite's testimony helped finish what law enforcement had started, exposing the inner workings of the Gambino family and putting several key figures behind bars. Many in the old world called him a rat, a traitor, the worst thing a mobster could be. But Alite saw it differently. He wasn't betraying a code, he was exposing a lie. The brotherhood he had believed in had betrayed him long before he ever opened his mouth. What he did was survival, not cowardice. But a different kind of bravery, the courage to face the truth of what his life had become. Prison became another chapter in his story, harsh but clarifying. Inside those gray walls, stripped of everything he once thought defined him, he began to rebuild his mind. He read endlessly, wrote letters, and began to reflect on the life he had lived. For the first time, he could see it from the outside, the violence, the paranoia, the hollow victories. He began to understand what had driven him and what it had cost him. As he sat in his cell at night, the noise of other inmates fading into the distance, he found an odd kind of peace. Not redemption, not yet, but awareness. The realization that he had survived where so many others hadn't. And that maybe, just maybe, his story could serve as a warning to others still walking the path he had once glorified. By the time he was released, John Alite was no longer the man who once prowled the streets of New York in tailored suits and bulletproof arrogance. He was something else, not quite redeemed, but reborn. He had walked away from the underworld, faced his demons, and lived to tell the tale. But as he looked back on the choices that brought him here, one question still lingered: had he truly escaped the life, or was it simply a part of him that would never fade? Outside the prison gates, the world was waiting. Reporters, old associates, new enemies. The story of the hitman who had betrayed the Gotti family was far from over. It was only entering its next act, one that would test whether John Alite could truly outrun his past or if the shadows of the Mafia would follow him forever. Freedom came quietly for John Alite. When the prison gates opened, he stepped into a world that felt foreign, colder, and strangely hollow. The air smelled different, cleaner, but heavier. After years behind bars, he was free, yet part of him remained locked in the past. Because even though the system had released him, his memories never would. New York had changed. The streets he once ruled were no longer his kingdom, they belonged to another generation that barely remembered his name. The bars, the clubs, the corners, all different now. But one thing remained the same: the whispers. People still talked about John Alite, the man who had betrayed the Gotti family. Some said he was a survivor. Others called him a rat. In the underworld, there was no middle ground. He lived cautiously, always checking his mirrors, always expecting the past to appear at his door. Old instincts never died. Even in freedom, he carried the paranoia of a man who had lived too long in the shadows. Death threats surfaced now and then, sometimes through anonymous calls, sometimes in coded words online. He took them seriously, but he didn't hide. He had lived with danger all his life, fear was simply part of his existence. But the real reckoning wasn't outside. It was inside. Alone at night, Alite faced the ghosts that prison walls couldn't contain. The faces of those he'd hurt. The friends he'd lost. The choices he couldn't take back. He'd see them in dreams, old crew members, former allies, victims, all staring in silence. He no longer justified what he'd done. The code of the streets, once sacred, now felt like a lie that had stolen his soul. So, he began to write. At first, it was scattered, fragments of thought, pieces of memory, things too heavy to speak aloud. But soon, those writings became his therapy, his way to confront the man he once was. The media came calling, journalists, documentarians, podcasters, all wanting the inside story. When he finally spoke publicly, it wasn't out of ego. It was out of exhaustion. The truth was the only thing he had left to give. His interviews were calm, deliberate, almost meditative. He spoke of fear, loneliness, and the emptiness of power. Gone was the pride of a gangster, in its place was the humility of a man stripped bare. He warned others about the life he once glorified. "There's no honor in destruction," he said. Softly. "No future in fear." To his surprise, people listened. Letters began arriving, from parents, students, ex-convicts. Some thanked him for his honesty, others for saving their children from following his path. The hate was still there, but now it was matched by gratitude. Slowly, his name began to change meaning, not just as the hitman who betrayed the Mafia, but as the man who told the truth about it. Yet redemption was not without pain. Sometimes, old faces resurfaced, men from the past, carrying resentment or sorrow. He faced them without anger. He didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did he expect it. He had accepted that some wounds never heal. His reckoning wasn't about being forgiven, it was about being honest, with others and with himself. One evening, Alite visited the grave of an old associate. The cemetery was quiet, rain tapping softly on the stones. Standing there, he whispered to the dead, "We all thought we were invincible. Turns out, we were just temporary." That night, he finally understood what reckoning meant. It wasn't about punishment or forgiveness, it was about understanding. Accepting that you can't change your past, but you can choose what kind of man you'll be after it. As he walked away from the grave, the skyline glowed in the distance, the same city that had made him and destroyed him. For the first time, John Alite felt something close to peace. Not because he'd escaped his past, but because he'd stopped running from it. His reckoning wasn't an end, it was the beginning of finally being free. In his later years, John Alite lived quietly, far from the noise of the world he once ruled. The chaos, the fear, the constant tension, all of it had faded into memories that felt like scenes from another life. He had become something the streets never expected him to be, a man at peace. To some, he would always be a traitor, the hitman who turned on the Gotti family, who broke the sacred code of silence. But to others, he represented something else, a man who had faced his darkness and survived it. His life was no longer about reputation or revenge, it was about reflection. He spent his days speaking to those who still stood at the crossroads he once knew, young men hungry for power, lost souls seduced by the illusion of respect. His message was calm and simple: the streets don't love you. They'll use you until you're gone. There was no arrogance in his tone, no need to prove himself. The man who had once taken lives now saved them with his words. The violence that had once defined him had given way to understanding, a fragile kind of redemption that came not from forgiveness, but from truth. At night, as he sat by his window, he often thought of the friends he'd buried, the choices he could never undo. The city lights still glowed like they always had, but he saw them differently now, not as territory or power, but as reminders of everything he had lived through. John Alite's story was never one of heroes or villains. It was a story of survival, of a man who learned, too late, perhaps, that the greatest victory is not ruling others, but reclaiming your own soul.